The overall idea in the first parak of Shoftim is simply to indicate the areas that were not yet conquered upon the death of Yoshua, with a few backward reviews of Kalev and the like. And we talked first about Yehuda and Shimon conquering various territories. Then it moves to Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef is, of course, a collective term for Ephraim and Menashe. Ephraim is directly north of Binyamin, and north of Ephraim is half of Menashe, with the other half being east of the Jordan River. Let me just remind you that the Mishkan at this point, and this already happened in Yoshua's time, is located in Shiloh. There is no Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim yet. And the Mishkan in Shiloh, which existed for the whole period of the Judges, happens to be in the Chelek of Ephraim, right? So keep in mind that Ephraim is a very, very important section, because that, in fact, is the place where the Korbanos were brought, and the Korban Tamid, the Musaf, the Mishkan, was in Shiloh until the days of Eli. So going over to Beis Yosef, Ephraim and Menashe, so it mentions that they spied out, meaning an area they didn't conquer yet, they spied out the city of Beis El, and the name of the city was originally Luz. Now, if those words sound familiar, they should, because indeed they are mentioned explicitly in the Chumash, that Yaakov Avinu, when he was running away from the wrath of Esav on the way to Lavan's house, so Yaakov Avinu fell asleep, and he had a great dream of the wondrous ladder whose feet were on the ground, and it went all the way to Shemayim. And the Malachei Elokim, the angels of God, were Olim v'Yordim ba, were going up and down. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised Yaakov that he would take care of him, and he would bring him back in safety. And if you remember, Yaakov called the name of that city Beis El, the house of God, because he saw Hashem, or he perceived Hashem there. And what does the Torah say? V'ulam, however, Luz, Shem Ha'ir, La Rishona, Luz was the original name of the city. Yaakov called it Beis El. So l'chayra, though, it's a little odd that hundreds and hundreds of years later, it hadn't been called Luz since Yaakov's time, and yet it still says Beis El. That was originally Luz. Now, Chazal make this much more confusing than a simple reading of the Chumash, meaning a simple reading of the Chumash is Yaakov had his dream in the city of Luz, or on the outskirts of Luz, and he renamed Luz Beis El because it was the house of God, and he built a Mizbeach, and he dedicated it to God. Now, you know that Chazal make it much more complicated than that, although it's not really relevant to this pasuk. Chazal actually say that Yaakov Avinu wanted to go back to Yerushalayim to pray in the HaRav, because he knew that was a holy place. And what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did was, Hashem brought the HaRav, or the Temple Mount, all the way to Beis El. So when Yaakov called the place Beis El, he really wasn't calling Luz Beis El. He was saying, this is the house of God because this is the HaRav. In other words, Hara Maria was Nekra Bimkoma. So the place where Yaakov actually had his dream, although in terms of latitude and longitude, would have been Beis El, but in terms of the actual ground, he was on the ground of the HaRav itself, right? Hashem brought that there. So that goes back to the Chumash. If you remember, there's a long Rashi that goes through the complexities of the notion of uprooting Har HaMoriah Limkomo and bringing it to where Yaakov Avinu is. But nevertheless, that doesn't change the Pashut Pshat that Yaakov was physically, geographically situated in Luz, which he renamed Beis El. But interestingly enough, this is located in the Chelek of Ephraim. It was not yet conquered in the lifetime of Yoshua, and the conquest of Beis El. Now again, I'm assuming the Canaanites didn't call it Beis El, was the Jewish name for it. So This is also interesting that we referred to the city by the Jewish name, even though that is not what the inhabitants called it. The Canaanite inhabitants didn't call it Beis El, they called it Luz, but we called it Beis El, because that's what Yaakov called it. And this is describing, in a few psukim, the conquest of Beis El. Now, as a little aside, I'm going to digress, nothing to do with the book of Shoftim, Bichlal u'Bichlal, but there's a very interesting Gemara in Psachim. The Gemara in Psachim says that each of the Avos had a different descriptive term for the Makom HaMikdash, the place of the Beis HaMikdash. Avram Avinu called it a mountain, right? Because remember, the Makom HaMikdash is where Avram was going to sacrifice Yitzchak. And what did Avram call the Temple Mount, which originally was Har HaMoriah? But Avram didn't call it Har HaMoriah. Avram called it Hashem Yireh. God should see the Mesiras Nefesh of my willingness to sacrifice my son, and that should be an eternal merit for Am Yisrael. So Avram Avinu called it Hashem Yireh, but he also referred to it as Har HaMoriah. So Avram called it a mountain. Now Yitzchak called the Temple Mount a field, because when Yitzchak was 40 years old, and little Rivka, who was only 3, or Taisa brings a sheet of 14, was brought to him. So the pasuk says, "Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basada lifnais arev." Yitzchak went out to lasuach, to converse in the field as the evening was coming. And Chazal say in Maseches Brachos that lasuach, to converse, is a reference to davening, and this is actually the pasuk that Yitzchak was mesakein mincha. Perhaps derech leitzanos, one could prove Yitzchak was a Hasidic Yid, because it says he davened mincha lifnos arev, as it was getting dark. Late mincha, okay, the seder. But the truth is, erev in the Chumash doesn't mean dark. It means anything after chatzos of the day is already called towards erev. So it's not a proof how early or late he davened. But be it as it may, Chazal say that where would he daven? He would daven by the Temple Mount, the Makom Tefillah. So Avraham called it a har, a mountain. Yitzchak called it a field. And Yaakov, who called it Beis El, because even though it was a different city, but the Temple Mount was uprooted that area, he called it a Bayis, he called it a home or a house. The Gemara in Psachim, Avraham called it Har, Yitzchak called it Soda, Yaakov called it Bayis. Now the Gemara quotes psukim to show those 3 names, but the Gemara does not explain what is the significance of those 3 appellations, those three terms. So again, the Meforshim have different ways of explaining it. One idea is that a har is primarily defensive, meaning if you're being besieged by an enemy. So a mountain is a safe place to be. Although we looked yesterday at the anomaly that Bnei Yehuda could defeat the people in the mountains and not the people in the valleys, but that's the opposite of what it normally is. Normally, people on a mountain are in a very good defensive position. In fact, that is why Yerushalayim became a strategically important city in Eretz Yisrael, just in terms of military access, because it's on a hill, even though it's not such a high hill, but that gives a strategic advantage. Enemies try to come to you, you can hurl down rocks and boiling water or whatever it would be. Gravity is in your favor when you're on a mountain. So seen in this way, one way of perceiving the Makom HaMikdash is it protects us, number one, from external enemies, but it also protects us from all of the bad stuff in society as a whole. It's a place of refuge, a place where you escape from Tuma. You escape from the bad environment that exists in the world. So one way of looking at a mountain is a place of protection and escape from the negative forces that exist in the outside world. And that's one way of looking at the Beis HaMikdash. It's a place where I can escape from everything that's going on. But Yitzchak added something, because if you simply perceive of Beis HaMikdash or Shul or Yeshiva, because it then gets extended to these other things, as a way of escaping from the negative, that does not create yet something positive in your growth. That simply says, I'm keeping away from the bad influences. Okay. Well, the same thing would be true if you'd sleep all day. There are no bad influences operating on you, right? You got to do something positive. So that's the mashal of Yitzchak. That's a field, because a field is a place of productivity commensurate to the effort that you put in. Now, there are no guarantees. Obviously, it's all totally in Hashem. But generally speaking, the more you cultivate the garden with fertilizer and all the different work, the better the yield. So that's Yitzchak's take on the Beis HaMikdash, which again gets extended in later Doros to synagogues, Batei Kinesios, that are called Beis Mikdash Ma'at, Yeshivos, Makom HaTorah, that on one level they're the mountain where you escape from the negativity. On the other level, they are places of growth and aliyah, and that growth and that aliyah is connected to the amount of work that you put in, and that's a field. The growth of the field is kind of connected to the effort that you put in to create the field. As Chazal say in Maseches Megillah, everyone knows the famous Gemara, if a person says, Yagati v'loi matzasi, a person says, I worked hard to understand the Torah and I didn't find success, al tamin, don't believe the person. Because you work hard, you will have hatzlacha. And vice versa, if a person is overconfident and says, lo yagati umatzasi, I didn't work and I achieved great success. Also, al tamin, don't really believe it. Yagati umatzasi, that's tamin. Right, so that's the field. Now, Yaakov's emphasis on Bayis, which doesn't just mean house, but it means home, is already emphasizing the idea of a relationship. A home is a family, right? A home is not just a building. A home is a family, the notion of a connection between different people. And Yaakov is highlighting the idea that the Mikdash was a place of achdus and a place of unity and a place of togetherness, the Shalosh Regalim, where we identified as a single nation. See, it's hard for us to understand. I mean, obviously we have problems with achdus even today, but you have to understand something. When Klal Yisrael was tribally based, the idea of achdus intrinsically was not such a pashut intuitive idea. We're going to see later in the book of Shoftim some very, very dramatic and sad events that the Shvatim actually perceived themselves, before there was a melech, a centralized government, they perceived themselves as separate countries. City-states. They weren't city-states, they were larger, but separate states that shared a common religion. Right? Lahavdil, there are Catholics in France, and there are Catholics in England, and Catholics in America. They don't belong to the same nation. They have the same religion. So Klal Yisrael perceived of Judaism as a religion, but hey, if I'm Reuben and you're Shimon or whatever, we're not in the same country. We are a different nation. So we're not really the same. You have to understand, it's very, very similar, again, lahavdil, to the American Civil War, where before the Civil War, states looked at themselves as separate countries. In fact, they point out, it's interesting, journalistically, before the Civil War, United States was a plural noun. Like a newspaper would say, the United States were reluctant to make a certain decision. After the Civil War, the journalistic convention changed, as grammatically it is today. The United States was reluctant. Do you have the difference in that formulation? United States as a plural is saying they are separate states. Remember, the term state actually means a country, a nationality. Like England is a state, or Great Britain is a state, or the United Kingdom is a state. It goes through different names, whatever it is. United Kingdom is a state, France is a state, Germany is a state, Israel is a state. Medinat Yisrael. In fact, it's a little anomalous that we would talk about Medinat Yisrael and we talk about Medinat Maryland. I mean, it's not the same. Medinat Yisrael is a sovereign country. Medinat Maryland is a state. But the original meaning of state was a nation. So it used to be United States, the united different states, made a certain decision. And that's why the South took the opinion that they could leave the Union. They could be their own thing. The Civil War was Mechadesh, that, you were one nation. Okay, now I'm bringing up Civil War not because I want to lecture on American history per se, although it is an interesting history, but because the issues that Klal Yisrael faces during the period of the Shoftim is actually very, very, very similar. What's your nation? Right? So if you would have stopped somebody in the time of the Shoftim, he says, what nation do you belong to? They might not have said, Am Yisrael. They might have said, Am Yisachar, Am Reuven. Okay? Part of what a melech established was a single entity. So, therefore, the idea of going back to Beis HaMikdash, the Shalosh Regalim assume a very important, we don't always often talk about this. We look at Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, the great spiritual holidays, the mitzvah of coming to the Mikdash. And we tend to look at it as an individual chiyuv. I'm mechuyev to go to the Mikdash and bring my olas re'iyah. And for sure it is an individual chiyuv. But you can't ignore the fact that it was a way of the nation coming together, of reminding us that even though we live in this territory, and that territory, and that territory, and that territory, we're Am Yisrael. Kind of like the occasional all yeshiva mishmor that Ohr Somayach likes to do, right? It says, yeah, you're sent, right? We stop you middle of the night. What yeshiva do you go to? So you're going to say center. And another one's going to say mechina. No, you go to Ohr Somayach. We have divisions within Ohr Somayach, right? One yeshiva, right? That's why we have what they call all yeshiva, mishmor, whatever they call it. So, well, maybe I shouldn't say L'Havdil. Yeshiva is a Makom Mikdash too. But in many, many ways, one of the inyanim of the Shalosh Regalim was to reinforce within Am Yisrael a sense that we are one nation. That even though we're living in different tribal areas, and in many ways, particularly before there was a melech, there was a concept of each tribe was its own malchus, so to speak. But the Shalosh Regalim, we come together. Now again, let me remind you, during the Tekufa of the Shoftim, the place of Aliyah L'Regel was not Yerushalayim. Remember that? The place of Aliyah L'Regel was Shiloh. But so what? There still was a mitzvah of all of Klal Yisrael being Ayla L'Regel. Right? So just to remind you, the story of Chana not having a child and going to the Mishkan and Eli suspecting that she was drunk and then blessing her, that happened in the Mishkan of Shiloh, not in the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. All right, so be it as it may, I'm digressing a little bit, but we have these three names for the Mikdash. Avram called it a mountain, protection from the negative. Yitzchak called it a field, a place of productivity and growth, commensurate to the work and effort that you put in. And Yaakov called it a Bayis to connote the idea of unity and achdus in Klal Yisrael. And the reason why that belonged to Yaakov more than the other two of us is simply because only Yaakov Avinu was zeicha, although not without problems, to an achdus in the sense that all of his children became part of one nation. Meaning, unlike Abraham, that had the Yishmael and the Yitzchak, and unlike Yitzchak, who had the Yaakov and the Esav, Yaakov Avinu Everybody was indeed one family, although we had Mechiras Yosef, we had plenty of problems, but we were one family. We were mitaso shalema. All of his children belonged to the Jewish people, and that is why he's connected on the level of Bayis. So that's pshat number one of the three names that were given to the Mikdash. But let me give you a pshat number two, at least on the last point, on Yaakov. He doesn't really explain the Avram and the Yitzchak. And this is from a sefer that's a very interesting sefer, a little bit of a controversial sefer. This is a sefer called Ohr Somayach. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's also been translated in at least two English translations. Ohr Somayach was a book written by a Hungarian Rav, big posek, Rav Yisachar Dov Teichtal, and he died in the Holocaust, in the very end of the Holocaust when the Nazis overran Hungary. If you know your Holocaust history, Hungary was overrun by the Nazis fairly late in the war, and the destruction of Hungarian Jewry was very, very rapid, simply because the Germans knew they were going to be losing the war very soon, and they were determined to kill literally as many Jews as they could. So the rapidity of the Holocaust in Hungary, although numerically many more Jews were Polish. Poland had a much larger Jewish population, but the rapidity was just in a few months. So Rav Teichel died in the Holocaust, but shortly before he died, he wrote a sefer. I think it was the last Jewish sefer published in Hungary, printed in Hungary before the Nazis overran the country. And it was a very interesting book, because here's the thing. Rav Teichel was a Munkacher Chassid. Now, Munkach was an extremely anti-Zionist Hasidus. It would make Satmar look like Mizrahi. Satmar is moderate, right? Munkach is the real deal, the real thing. Zionism, rishus, etc. And Rav Teichel had a big change of heart as he saw and he heard of Jews being murdered, starved, tortured. And he began to be misbainain. What was the reason? Why is Hashem bringing it onto us? So he concluded, and he was a big Talmid Chacham, that it's because we were lacking in our Avas Yisrael, number one, with all of the machloksim among Jews. And number two, we were lacking in our love for Eretz Yisrael. And he combined those two ideas, and he wrote a book, Ohr Somayach, which is a huge book, and he draws on many Makairis, whether it's Gemaros, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Midrashim, Sifrei Chasidus, Sifrei Kabbalah, Chesab Sofer, V'Yonis Neipshitz, like basically many sources to write about the idea that what is Ma'akev the Geula, what is Ma'akev Mashiach, is the lack of Avas Yisrael and the lack of Avas Eretz Yisrael. And this was so important that he took the position it was even worthwhile to cooperate with non-religious elements, because that creates both an Achdus and that creates Chibas Haaretz, etc. So he was often called the Hungarian Rav Kook, because he came out in much of the same way that Rav Kook came out. But stylistically, they are very, very different. Stylistically, Rav Kook's style is poetic. Rav Kook's style is mystical. Rav Kook's style is very obscure because it's poetic and mystical. Rav Teichel overwhelms you with sources. I mean, he'll make a point and then he'll just hit you with like 25 makoros that make the point. So it's much more of a technical book than Rav Kook. It's not a poetic book. It is a technical discussion of gazillions of makairis. But the bottom line is essentially Rav Kook's philosophy. So as a result, in the Haredi world, Ohr Somayach is a little bit controversial in the sense that many feel it's a little bit too Zionistic in his approach. Different people will look at it different ways. I'm not here to tell you one way or the other, but this is Rav Teichel's book, and it's a very, very important and moving book, because remember that it was written or finished relatively shortly before his death. I mean, basically, this was his last will and testament. Now, the Dati Leumi world absolutely loves it, because it shows how the ultra Haredi Munkach eventually came over to the MS. Okay, the truth is, I can give you examples from the other side. So different people cross over. So, did he cross over to the light side or the dark side? That's a matter of how you define the light side and the dark side. But nevertheless, he's very popular because he's really ultra Haredi, who became an ardent Zionist in terms of his overall philosophy. Okay, that's just autobiographical or biographical information. Be aware of the Sefer. But the word I want to share with you is that in the middle of his discussions, because he digresses a lot into different Vertlach and different Torah thoughts, he offers a fantastically beautiful explanation why Yaakov called it Bayis. And he focuses, so I am indeed digressing today, but he focuses on a pasuk that we recite in the Shiur Shel Yom of Yom Chamishi. You're going to say it tomorrow, and we recite it on Rosh Hashanah. It's about Rosh Hashanah. Tiku b'chodesh shofar, blow upon the new moon of Tishrei, the shofar. Ba'kesa, kesa is when the moon is covered up, because it's not yet visible, the first of the month. Liyom Chagenu, it's our holiday. Ki chok li Yisrael hu, it is the law for Yisrael. Mishpat, it is the day of judgment. Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment. Lelokei Yaakov, to the God of Yaakov. So, Rav Teichel says, you'll notice that when we describe God as judging us, Mishpat, because Rosh Hashanah, he judges us, we say he's the God of Yaakov. We connect Hashem to Yaakov when it comes to judgment. Why Elokei Yaakov? Why don't you say Elokei Avoseinu, like we say in Shmoneh Esrei? Why, when it comes to God judging us, do we specifically focus on Yaakov? So listen to this. Rav Teichel connects it to the Gemara in Pesachim that Avraham called the Makom HaMikdash Har, Yitzchak called it Sadeh, Yaakov called it Bayis. This is what he says. What's the difference between Har, Sadeh, Bayis? Avraham and Yitzchak described the Makom HaMikdash the way it was at that time. Avraham saw it as a mountain. By Yitzchak's time, people were planting things there. He saw it as a field. Avraham and Yitzchak are describing present realities. But when Yaakov calls it a Bayis, there's no Bayis there. There's no Beis HaMikdash there. There's no building there. So what is Yaakov doing? Yaakov is not describing what is. Yaakov is describing what might be, what it will become. So when God judges us on Rosh Hashanah, God in his mercy is not just judging us by what we are. He's judging us by what we might become. And in fact, that's exactly what you think about in Rosh Hashanah. You don't say to God, I'm a tzaddik, I deserve to be saved. But you say to Hashem, give me another chance because of what I might become. Even though Hashem knows the story, that's another question. But so that's why we connect it to Yaakov. Because Yaakov was willing to see the hidden potential that had not yet become revealed and apparent. That's the idea of Bayis. And we ask Hashem to see and be cognizant of the hidden potential within us, right? And that's why the mishpat, the judgment, is connected to Bayis, to Yaakov. Yeah.
How does this correlate with? How does this work with what happened with Ishmael?
Yeah. So I would answer that it works in our favor, not against us. Meaning to say, Yishmael is a good guy right now, a relatively good guy, so we're not going to penalize him because of the Russia he will become. But the other way around, if I'm not a good guy, but I have a potential that I could become, then Hashem will look at the future. Lagabe zechus, not lagabe chova. You see? Okay? So this was a digression simply because of Beis El, because Beis El is where Yaakov called the Temple Mount a Bayis, even though he wasn't there, but remember, Hara Maria Nekra Mimkomo. But be it as it may, it is the Beis El, which was Luz, Yaakov's place where he had his dream, is in the Chelek of Ephraim, and we're going to, I guess next week, we're going to look at the few psukim that talk about the conquest of Beis El. Okay?
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.